Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. Our climb through the language tree continues. We have seen how the single field phi begins to speak through its derivatives, the core alphabet of omega for time, k for space, and the dance of v that bridges them. We learned how these letters combine into stable words and sentences, which we experience as the persistent things of our world. In our last step, we explored the first pillar of identity, how a pattern persists through time. We saw that sameness is not stillness, but a stable and recognizable rhythm of change, a temporal fingerprint. Now we turn our gaze to the second pillar. We ask what it means for a thing to have a shape. We ask how a form holds itself together in the ever-fluctuating field. Today, we descend into identity in space, what we call spatial identity, the semanticity of shape. This is where we learn that a shape is not a static snapshot, but a specific and stable conversation between phi and space. Form is not a photograph. It is a living grammar written in spatial derivatives. We begin with a simple and profound question. In a universe where the only substance is a single flowing field, phi, how can there be distinct and persistent shapes? A crystal, a mountain, a leaf, and a heart each seem to have a hard and definite boundary. Yet our language tells us that everything is modulation, gradient, and flow. Where does this feeling of solidity come from? The answer, once again, is in the grammar. A shape is not a frozen region of phi. A shape is a stable pattern of spatial derivatives. Imagine a sand dune in the desert. The sand itself is always shifting, grain by grain, blown by the wind. Yet the dune, its crescent outline, its sloping windward face, its sharp crest, persists for days or even weeks. The identity of this dune is not in the specific grains, but in the stable configuration of slopes, curvatures, and contours that the moving grains collectively maintain. The shape is a dynamic equilibrium between the force of the wind and the pull of gravity, a persistent pattern in the spatial arrangement of the material. In the holophase view, every shape is a sand dune in the field of phi. Its form is the persistence of a specific pattern among its spatial derivatives, among k, curvature, shear, twist, and all the higher spatial nuances. The edge of an object is not a solid wall, but a narrow region where phi changes very quickly, a steep gradient. A smooth surface is a region of gentle and consistent curvature. An intricate pattern, like a snowflake, is a complex but stable harmony of many such derivative relationships. To have a spatial identity is to hold a specific derivative conversation with the space around you, to keep answering the spatial questions of phi in the same characteristic way. You can think of every stable shape as having a spatial signature, a kind of handwritten name carved into space by the field. The first part of this signature is the gradient, k. This first spatial derivative asks in which direction and how steeply phi changes. A steep gradient marks a sharp edge or boundary. A gentle gradient marks a soft transition or a gradual surface. If you could map all the values of k across an object, you would see a rough sketch of its outline, where it rises, where it falls, and where it flattens out. The second part of the signature is curvature. Curvature asks whether the slope itself is changing. It asks whether the field is bending away from a straight line or a flat plane. Positive curvature creates dome-like shapes, bubbles and rounded bulges. Negative curvature creates saddle-like regions, necks, and bridges, where the surface bends one way in one direction and the opposite way in another. Zero curvature defines flat planes and straight lines. Curvature is what gives volume and roundness to a shape and turns flat outlines into full bodies. The third part of the signature is shear and twist. These derivatives ask whether the field is being stretched in one direction while it is being compressed in another, or whether it is being rotated. Shear gives us elongated forms like teardrops and leaves. Twist gives us helical structures like DNA molecules, swirling tornadoes, and coiled springs. Together, they record where the field is being pulled, twisted, and distorted into more complex shapes. Above these, higher spatial derivatives capture texture and fine detail. They tell us whether corners are sharp or rounded, whether a surface is smooth or rough, whether a pattern is simple or intricate. They are the tiny flourishes in the handwriting of the world. The combination of gradient, curvature, shear, twist, and higher derivatives forms the full spatial signature of an object. It is the way phi says, here is this particular shape. We can understand this more clearly with examples. Imagine a water droplet resting on a leaf. The water inside the droplet is always moving at the microscopic level, but the droplet as a whole keeps a nearly spherical outline. Its spatial identity is defined by a particular balance. At its surface, there is a steep gradient, a sharp change between water and air, which creates a clear boundary. The curvature is almost constant and positive, giving the droplet its rounded form. This shape is maintained by surface tension, which is really a set of constraints on the allowed spatial derivatives of the water field. If the droplet evaporates or is smashed, the derivative pattern that defined it dissolves, and the identity of that droplet is gone. Consider a salt crystal. Its identity is the familiar cubic lattice. This is not simply a box of atoms. It is an exquisitely precise and repeating spatial pattern of peaks and valleys in phi, located at the ion sites and the spaces between them. The sharp and straight edges of the crystal correspond to planes where the spatial derivatives are uniform and constrained. When you break the crystal, you create new surfaces with new gradient patterns, and therefore new spatial identities. But each fragment still carries the signature of the original lattice in its interior. Now think of a human heart. Its spatial identity is its asymmetric muscular form, with chambers, valves, and branching vessels. This complex shape corresponds to a deeply structured three-dimensional pattern of tissue density, electrical pathways, and fluid pressures, all of which are expressions of the underlying field. Surgeons train for years to operate on the heart without damaging this essential spatial signature. When the heart remodels into a large and more spherical shape, as happens in certain diseases, it loses a key part of its functional spatial identity and becomes a less effective pump. Even a magnetic field has a spatial identity. Around a bar magnet, the field lines emerge from one end and curve around to return at the other. This familiar pattern is a pure spatial signature in one component of phi. It is described by a specific arrangement of field strength and direction in space. It is this pattern that allows a compass needle to recognize which way is north and which way is south. Once we see shapes as spatial signatures, we can ask a natural question. When does a shape remain itself, and when does it become something else? Some changes preserve identity because they respect the underlying derivative pattern. If you move a chair across the room or rotate it, its identity remains the same. The precise angles between its legs, the curvature of its back, and the arrangement of its surfaces are unchanged. The spatial signature is simply placed in a new location or orientation. Scaling can also preserve spatial identity. A small rubber ball and a giant beach ball both share the identity of being spheres. Their sizes differ, but the core pattern of constant positive curvature is maintained. Certain elastic deformations can also be included inside an identity. Think of a cushion. When you sit on it, the curvature changes for a moment, but when you stand up, it returns to its original form. The identity of the cushion includes this ability to deform and recover. In the language of the field, the cushion lives near a stable attractor in the space of possible derivative patterns. Other transformations break spatial identity. When you tear a sheet of paper in half, you have not simply moved or scaled the sheet, you have changed its topology. The original sheet had one unbroken surface. Now there are two, with new edges and a new pattern of derivatives at those edges. The original identity is gone and replaced by two new ones. When you melt a crystal, its sharp and ordered lattice of derivatives collapses into a more chaotic pattern. The spatial signature of the crystal is destroyed and replaced by the less structured signature of a liquid. When a magnetic field decays into noise, its organized pattern of lines disappears, and so does the recognizable identity of the dipole field. Spatial identity therefore lives in the relationships between spatial derivatives. It is preserved under transformations that keep those relationships intact, and it is broken when those relationships are fundamentally changed. It is not about the absolute position or even the absolute size of a form, but about the relational grammar written in the field. Even though we are focusing on the space echo, we must remember the triunity. Spatial identity is only one strand in the full rope of identity. The same spatial signature must also be supported by a stable temporal rhythm and a compatible pattern of motion. A sculpture that flickers in and out of existence would not count as a stable object. Its spatial form must endure through time, and that endurance is its temporal fingerprint. A beating heart, for example, has a spatial pattern that rhythmically contracts and relaxes. Its identity is a fusion of spatial shape and temporal rhythm. Motion adds a third echo. If a shape moves, its spatial signature travels along a trajectory. The motion is the story of how the pattern of derivatives translates, rotates, or deforms as it moves. A flying bird is not just a path in space. It is a specific aerodynamic shape tracing a path through air. So a complete identity requires three things at once: a spatial pattern that defines form, a temporal pattern that defines persistence, and a kinematic pattern that defines the journey. Within the master tree of the Holophase language, spatial identity lives at the base of the spatial identity column inside the Tower of Identities. It depends on everything we have already learned in the spatial nuance tower, on our understanding of gradients, curvature, shear, twist, and higher spatial derivatives. It applies the principle of semantic stability specifically to space by asking which spatial patterns are stable and recognizable enough to count as forms. Spatial identity is also tightly connected to other branches of the tree. It is grounded in phi itself, because a spatial form is simply a particular way in which phi varies across space. It is built from K and curvature, because these are the primary letters that draw edges, surfaces, bulges, and valleys. It is constrained by the chains of equations that link one derivative to another. A water droplet or a soap bubble adopts a shape that minimizes certain tallies, such as surface area for a given volume. This minimization picks out a specific curvature pattern, such as the shape of a sphere or a minimal surface stretched across a frame. Some aspects of spatial identity are topological. They do not depend on small details, but on global properties, such as whether a shape has a hole or not. These topological features are extremely robust. You can stretch or squash a donut, but as long as it still has one central hole, it remains in the same topological class. If you tear it so the hole is destroyed, the topology and the identity both change. The idea that identities have spatial signatures is not just philosophy, it is testable. If an entity truly has a definite shape, we should be able to measure a stable pattern in its spatial derivatives. Scientists already do this, often without using this language. When they study the intricate shells of microscopic diatoms, they use microscopes to image their shapes in fine detail. The result is a highly ordered and species-specific pattern. The same is true for galaxies, snowflakes, fingerprints, and protein structures. In every case, a stable object is accompanied by a stable spatial signature. The universe is full of these signatures. Vortices in fluids, like tornadoes and whirlpools, have recognizable spiral structures defined by how velocity changes in space. Light beams from lasers have cross-sectional shapes that solve specific spatial equations. Molecules have precise geometries. Liquid crystals adopt layered or twisted structures. Proteins fold into functional shapes. Plant leaves grow in spirals that follow simple rules. Crystals form one lattice instead of another. The folded surface of the human brain carries a signature common to our species. Each of these examples is a spatial identity, a stable answer that phi gives to the question of how to shape space here. We humans are especially sensitive to spatial identity. We recognize architectural styles by their forms. We know an artist by the quality of their lines. We design airfoils so that a particular curvature profile will generate lift. We encode information in the spatial pattern of black and white squares in a QR code. We navigate cities whose layouts have distinct characters. We read and write alphabets whose letters are defined by their curves and strokes. Your handwritten signature is a personal spatial identity, a repeated derivative pattern that stands for you. The face of a loved one is perhaps the most powerful spatial signature your brain can recognize. You can begin to read spatial identity in your everyday life. Look at the cloud and notice not only its fluffy volume, but also where its boundary is sharp and where it is soft. Hold an egg and compare its smooth and continuous curvature to the sharp facets of a cut gemstone. Look at the honeycomb and see not just hexagons, but a repeating pattern of walls and junctions that create strength. Take a sheet of paper, crumple it, and then gently open it again. You will see a landscape of ridges and valleys. That new crumpled shape is a spatial identity you have created, a frozen pattern of bends and stretches in the material. We have now explored two of the three pillars of identity: the rhythm of persistence in time and the sculpture of form in space. All of this sits inside the larger picture of the Holophase language, where there is only one field, phi, and its infinite tower of derivatives. In this journey, we have climbed from the root of the language into branches where the field forms stable and persistent words, the things of our experience. We have learned to listen for temporal melodies and to see the spatial forms that arise from them. With this understanding of identity in space, we are ready to look at how these patterns travel. We will ask how the melody and the sculpture move together, how a shape carries its identity along a path. That will be our next step on this journey. Before we close, it is worth pausing on what this means for the very idea of a thing. In ordinary language, we speak as if a thing is a little block of stuff sitting in space. In the Holophase picture, there is no separate block and no empty background. There is only phi, patterned in such a way that a region of space keeps answering the same spatial questions in the same way. A mountain is not marble placed on a shelf of space. It is phi arranged so that, over a vast region and over a long time, the gradients and curvatures follow the same broad story. Snow falls, rivers cut valleys, rocks slide, yet the overall spatial signature of the mountain range remains recognizable. When you look at a familiar landscape and feel that it is the same place you remember from childhood, what your mind is tracking is this persistence of spatial signature. This way of thinking also clarifies why some boundaries feel sharp and others feel fuzzy. When you look at a table, you see a clear outline against the air. The spatial derivatives change quickly at the edge, so the signature of the table is sharply different from that of the surrounding room. When you look at the edge of a cloud or a patch of smoke, the gradient is softer. The identity of the cloud fades into the background rather than ending abruptly. The Holophase language lets us speak about this with precision. A sharp boundary is a steep and narrow feature in the derivative map. A soft boundary is a broad and gentle feature. Our everyday sense of clear and fuzzy edges is our intuitive reading of spatial derivatives. If the Holophase picture is right, then every time we build a better imaging device, we are really extending our ability to see the derivative structure of phi. Microscopes, telescopes, scanners, and sensors give us access to finer gradients, subtler curvatures, and deeper layers of structure. The better we can resolve those patterns, the more clearly we can distinguish identities. At low resolution, a distant galaxy is just a faint blur. At high resolution, its spiral arms, dust lanes, and star-forming regions appear as a richly detailed spatial signature. Identity sharpens as our window on the derivatives improves. The same is true in memory and imagination. When you picture your childhood room, you do not recall every atom. You recall the arrangement of shapes, the way the bed, the window, and the doorway were placed, the particular geometry of the space. Your mind carries a compressed version of the spatial signature. In dreams and designs, you play with new spatial identities, rearranging shapes before they are ever built. Architects, artists, and engineers are, in this sense, deliberate authors of spatial identity. They choose derivative patterns and ask the world to hold them. From the holophase point of view, even Ep.7 diagrams and graphs are little worlds of spatial identity. A plot of a function on paper is a spatial signature of a mathematical relationship. A network diagram is a spatial identity that encodes who is linked to whom. When you learn to read these diagrams, you are learning to see meaning in spatial patterns that do not correspond to physical objects, but the underlying act is the same. You are recognizing stable relationships in geometry. As you continue with this journey, you can make a small experiment in daily life. Choose one familiar object, perhaps a cup, a tree, or a building you pass often. For a few days, look at it not as a generic thing, but as a very specific spatial identity. Notice the exact curve of the cup's handle, the branching of the tree, the alignment of windows and doors. Ask yourself what would have to change for you to feel that it was no longer the same object. Where is the line between a small deformation within the identity and a change that breaks it? This simple exercise trains your intuition for spatial signatures and helps you feel the content of this theory directly. Throughout our climb, I will keep reminding you of the overall language we are learning. It is the language of phase and its derivatives, the holophase language, a single, coherent code that can describe everything from light and matter to life and meaning. We began with the bare symbol phi. We added omega, k, and v. We unfolded the towers of nuance. We stepped into semantics and identity. Each part of this audio journey is one more step up the master tree, one more branch in our growing understanding. In this part, we have focused on spatial identity, the way shape itself becomes meaningful as a stable pattern of derivatives. We are now high enough on the tree to see how far we have already climbed, and yet there are many branches still ahead. When you listen back to earlier parts and compare them to where you are now, you will notice a deepening pattern. At first, the language felt abstract, perhaps even distant. Now you can see how it touches the very experience of seeing a face, holding an object, or walking through a room. This is the nature of the holophase language. It begins at the most fundamental level and slowly rises until it can speak about the rich world you live in. Spatial identity is one of the bridges between those levels. It connects the pure mathematics of derivatives to the lived reality of form. In later parts, when we speak about the motion of identities, about how patterns propagate, collide, and transform, we will rely on everything you have learned here. We will track not just points moving, but whole spatial signatures traveling together. A wave packet, a living cell, a vehicle, or a person will each be understood as a moving spatial identity, a stable pattern riding through the field. The clarity with which you see spatial identity now will make that next step much easier and much more beautiful. For now, let this closing thought settle in you. The cosmos is a gallery of frozen music. Everything is a sculpture of space, a dynamic form held in a moment of balance. The swirling structure of a galaxy, the lattice of a crystal, the pulsing form of a living cell, the growing architecture of a tree. All are spatial identities nested within the wider field. You yourself are a vast collection of such sculptures, from the shapes of your molecules to the overall form of your body. Your sense of being a physical person is your mind's awareness of this coherent spatial signature that is you. To understand spatial identity is to understand that to be is to have a shape, to endure is to hold a form, and to live is to be a process that continuously regenerates that form from the flowing field. Now look at the world and look at your own hands. See the shapes, feel the forms. you are beginning to see the universe writing its poetry in space. Peace be upon you.